The day my supervising physician called my decade of surgical work a lucky streak. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I stood in that boardroom with my hands folded on the table and I smiled. Because I knew something he didn't. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I was 31 when I joined the cardiac surgery team at St. Marguerite Health Center in Ottawa. Not as a resident. I was past that. I came in as a fellow, 2 years out of my residency at McGill, with a publication record that my program director had called unusually strong for someone your age. I had done back-to-back overnight calls through my intern year without once losing a patient on the table. I had learned to read an ECG faster than most cardiologists twice my age. I had chosen cardiac surgery specifically because people told me it was too hard, too male, too brutal a specialty for a woman who looked the way I looked. Small, young, too soft around the eyes. My mentor used to say that doubt is just fuel if you know how to burn it. I burned it. St. Marguerite's was supposed to be the next step. It was one of the top cardiac centers in Ontario, known for complex valve replacements and high-risk bypass surgeries, the kind that other hospitals transferred out when they got scared. I had wanted to work there since my second year of medical school, when I read a case study published by their chief of cardiac surgery, a man named Dr. Aldrich Voss. The paper was brilliant. The technique was precise. I had practically memorized it. What the paper didn't tell me was what kind of man Dr. Voss was in person. I found out on my first day. He was standing at the nursing station when I walked in, reviewing a chart with one of the senior residents. He didn't look up when I introduced myself. I told him my name. I told him I was the new fellow. He flipped a page in the chart, said and then finally looked at me over the top of his reading glasses, with an specific look of a man I'd seen before. The specific look of a man recalculating whether you belong in the room he's standing in. So, "You're younger than I expected," he said. "I've been told that. The chart. I hope you can keep up. We move fast here." That was it. That was our introduction. I told myself it was fine. I told myself some people were like that. Abrupt, focused, not big on pleasantries. I had trained under difficult people before. I could handle difficult. What I hadn't prepared for was systematic. Over the next several weeks, I noticed a pattern. In rounds, Dr. Voss would take questions from the residents, even the first years, even when their suggestions were wrong, and he would engage with them, explain his reasoning, ask them follow-up questions. When I spoke, he would nod once, move on, and then 30 seconds later ask the male fellow beside me the same question I had just answered, as though my answer hadn't registered at all. In the OR, he would give real-time teaching to whoever was assisting him. When I assisted, he went quiet. Not hostile quiet, just absent. Like I was a very competent instrument holder and not a surgeon in training. In the weekly case conference, when I presented a patient, a 58-year-old man with severe aortic stenosis and a complicated history of diabetes and chronic kidney disease, Dr. Voss interrupted me twice to correct details that were not incorrect. The third time he interrupted, I stopped mid-sentence and said, clearly and without raising my voice, I was getting to that. The room went very still. He looked at me for a moment, then he said, "Good, go ahead," and didn't interrupt again. But after the conference, one of the other attendings, a woman named Dr. Suyan Park, who had been quietly kind to me since I arrived, caught up with me in the hallway. She walked beside me for a few steps without saying anything. Then she said, "He does that with everyone he doesn't trust yet. How long does it take?" I asked. She thought about it. "Depends on the person," she said, and kept walking. I held on to that. I kept my head down. I did my work. I showed up early and stayed late. I reviewed cases in the evenings at home, sitting at my kitchen table in the apartment I was renting near the Rideau Canal, with takeout from the Vietnamese place on the corner going cold beside me to eat. Called my mother on Sundays. She asked how it was going. I said, fine. She knew I was lying, but she didn't push. because she knew me well enough to know that pushing wouldn't help. My father asked if I had made friends. I said I was working on it. What I didn't tell either of them was that I had started keeping a document on my laptop. A running log of every surgery I assisted on, every patient outcome, every technique I refined or developed, not for any formal purpose. Just because I needed something concrete to hold on to. Proof, maybe, that I was doing what I came here to do. 6 months in, I had a case that changed things. She was 63, a retired school teacher from Canada, brought in by ambulance after collapsing during her morning walk. Her coronary angiogram showed a left main occlusion. The widowmaker, in common language. The kind of blockage that kills people before they make it to the hospital. She had made it, barely, and she needed surgery immediately. Her case was handed to Dr. Voss's team because it was a Friday evening and we had the OR. Dr. Voss was stuck in a meeting downtown. His fellow, the other fellow, the one who'd been there a year longer than me, was dealing with a post-op complication on another patient. The attending on call looked at me. I said, "I can do it." He hesitated. I knew what he was thinking. I was a fellow. This was one of the highest risk cardiac procedures we performed. If something went wrong, it would fall on him. I said, "I've done 11 left main bypasses. I have the numbers in my log. Call Dr. Voss, get verbal authorization, and I'll have her on bypass in 20 minutes. He called Dr. Voss. I didn't hear what was said. But 3 minutes later, he came back and told me to scrub in. We had her on bypass in 18 minutes. The surgery took 4 hours. There were 2 moments. One around the 90-minute mark and one near the end, where things got complicated in the way that cardiac surgeries sometimes do, quietly and all at once. Both times, I made the call I needed to make, and both times it was the right one. I knew it in the way you know things when you've spent enough years in the body of medicine that it starts to feel like instinct, though you know it isn't. It's just pattern recognition accumulated so deep it lives below language. She came off bypass with a strong rhythm. She was extubated the next morning. When I checked on her 2 days later, she was sitting up in bed, reading a novel. She asked me what the weather was like outside. I told her it was November in Ottawa, so not great. She laughed. I walked out of her room feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not pride exactly. More like alignment, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Doing exactly what I was built to do. I thought that surgery would change things with Dr. Voss. It didn't. Not the way I expected. He found me in the hallway the following Monday. He said, "Good outcome on the Friday case." Then he paused, like he was choosing his next words carefully. "Lucky, you had a clean field." I stopped walking. The field was clean because I controlled the bleeding at the 70-minute mark. That wasn't luck. He looked at me for a moment. His expression didn't change. "Keep it up," he said, and walked away. I stood there in the hallway for a long count of 3. Then I went back to work. 3 months later, the department head called a meeting. Not a regular case conference. A sit-down in the boardroom, the kind with name placards and a catered tray of sandwiches from the place down the street that everyone pretended to like. The topic, we were told in it, was the Russians, the restructuring of the fellowship program. There were funding changes coming through the hospital board. Some positions would be affected. I sat down with the others. There were 6 of us around the table, 3 attendings, 2 fellows, and the department head, Dr. Emmeline Ford, who had the quiet authority of someone who had spent 30 years being the smartest person in every room she walked into and had long since stopped needing to prove it. Dr. Voss was at the head of the table, which meant this was his restructuring. He went through the changes methodically. The department would consolidate from 2 fellows to 1 per cycle. Resources, he explained. Focus, quality over quantity. Then he looked at me, not at the other fellow, at me specifically, and said, "We'll be evaluating all fellows on a rolling basis, of course. Performance, research output, team integration. Team integration, I heard. What wasn't being said? The other fellow, whose name was Remy, and who was perfectly competent, and also happened to have been Dr. Voss's resident 2 years before I arrived, leaned back in his chair with the specific ease of someone who already knows how this ends. After the meeting, I caught Dr. Ford in the hallway. I said, "Can I ask you something directly?" She said yes, directly. I said, "Is this about performance or is this about something else?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked at me the way people look when they're deciding how honest to be. Then she said, "Document everything." And she walked away. That was all she said. Document everything. I went home that night and opened my laptop. I had over 8 months of records. Surgeries, outcomes, complication rates, research hours, peer reviews I had contributed to. I had 3 cases that were currently under review for a departmental quality improvement initiative. I had a manuscript I had been working on for the last 4 months, a case series on intraoperative decision-making in high-risk bypass. That was 2 weeks from being submission ready. I made a folder. I put everything in it. Then I did something I hadn't done before. I called my medical school mentor. Not my parents, not a friend, a woman who had trained at the University of Toronto in the 1990s, who had built her career in an era when what I was experiencing had no language at all. When women in surgical programs were simply expected to absorb whatever came at them and smile. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what was happening. Not the emotional version, the factual one, the chronology, the specific incidents, the meeting, the comment about luck, the team integration language. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Have you talked to the ombudsperson?" I hadn't. I hadn't wanted to go there yet. It felt like escalation. It felt like the kind of move that follows you. She said, "It might feel like a last resort, but the records you're building, they need to go somewhere that isn't just your laptop." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. The next morning, I made an appointment with the hospital's patient and staff advocacy office. Not a formal complaint, not yet. A consultation. I brought my folder. The woman I met with, whose job title was something careful and neutral, spent 45 minutes going through my documentation. She didn't offer opinions. She asked clarifying questions. She took notes. Before I left, she said, "This is thorough." She said it the way people say things when they mean more than the words. Meanwhile, I submitted my manuscript. Simultaneously, I did something I had been considering for a while. One of the cases in my log, the school teacher from Canada, the left main bypass, had been mentioned to me by Dr. Park as a potential candidate for a case presentation at the Ontario Cardiac Surgery Conference in Toronto. A regional meeting. Not a huge event, but the kind where the right people were in the room. I submitted an abstract. It was accepted. I didn't tell Dr. Voss. I told Dr. Park, and I told the department administrator, because I needed the scheduling accommodation. And I followed the correct protocol for getting it approved, but I didn't mention it to him directly, because I had stopped seeking his acknowledgement. That was the shift I hadn't expected. Not anger, not withdrawal, just a quiet severance from needing anything from him. I was going to do my work. I was going to let the work speak. The conference was on a Thursday in February. I drove down to Toronto the night before, stayed with a friend from residency, who lived in the annex, ate dinner with her at a place on Bloor that had very good dumplings and very bad wine, and fell asleep at 10 o'clock, like a person who had made peace with where they were. My presentation was the third slot of the morning session. I presented the case, the angiogram, the intraoperative complications, the decision points, the outcome. I walked through my reasoning at each juncture. I talked about the specific technique modification I had made at the 70-minute mark, the one Dr. Voss had attributed to a clean field. I had the data now. I had the operative notes, the perfusion records, The post-op blood works. I walked through it clearly, without drama. The way you walk through a proof. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the moderator, a cardiac surgeon from Hamilton, who I had never met, said, "That's a very elegant solution to a problem we see more often than we talk about. Would you consider writing that up as a technical note?" I said I already had a manuscript in submission. He asked which journal. I told him. He said, "Good." I drove back to Ottawa the next morning. I had a surgery at 7. 14 days later, I got an email from the journal. The manuscript was accepted pending minor revisions. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot and reread the email 3 times. Then I went inside. The conversation I had been preparing for happened 6 weeks after that. Dr. Voss called me into his office, not the boardroom, his own office, and sat across the desk from me with a stillness that told me he had prepared too. He said the fellowship evaluation had concluded. He said the department was moving forward with one fellow position as planned. He said that the decision had been a difficult one. Then he said, "Your clinical performance has been strong, but there are questions about your readiness for independent practice. Whether you're—" And he paused, choosing the word with what felt like deliberate care, "suited to the demands of this environment long term." I looked at him. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I opened the folder on my lap. I said, "I have my operative log here. 43 cases over 10 months, with outcomes data. My complication rate is 1.2%, which is below the departmental average according to the quality improvement report published last quarter, which, for context, I contributed to." I turned a page. I also have the acceptance letter for my manuscript from the journal and the abstract acceptance from the Ontario conference last month, where the moderator asked me to develop a technical note based on my presentation. I looked up. "So I'd like to understand specifically what the concern is. Because I don't see it in the data, Samas, exactly." And then something shifted in his face. Not remorse, exactly. More like recalibration. The moment when a man realizes the version of you he has been operating with is not the version sitting in front of him. He said, "The manuscript. What journal?" I told him. He was not obscure. He knew it. That everyone in the room would have known it. He said, "I wasn't a Roxit, aware you had submitted. I followed the correct process for independent submissions," I said. Dr. Park was listed as co-author, as I notified the department in advance. Another pause. "That's a significant piece of work," he said. His voice was different now. Not warm. I wasn't expecting warm, but leveled. Like something had been set down. I said, "Yes, it is." I didn't say anything else. I had learned over 10 months that the most powerful thing you can say sometimes is the thing you don't. What happened next was not a dramatic reversal. Life is not a movie. Dr. Voss did not apologize. He did not suddenly become a mentor. The fellowship position went to Remy, as it was always going to. The structure of that decision had been made before I walked into the room, and no amount of data was going to unbuild it in a day. But things changed. Dr. Ford called me into her office 2 weeks later. She told me that the advocacy office consultation had generated a formal record. She told me there would be an independent review of fellowship evaluation criteria. She told me, carefully, that my file had been flagged as a reference case. She also told me that she had spoken with the director of Direct Surgery of Alberta, who had seen my conference presentation through a colleague. "Grayson, he'd like to speak with you," she said. "About a position Edmonton in winter is not what most people would choose. I know that. But I had not built my career by choosing what was easy. The position was a senior clinical fellowship with an attached research appointment. The kind that comes with lab space and grant eligibility and a title you can put on a CV that opens doors. The kind that turns into a staff position if you want it." I moved in June. I packed my apartment near the Rideau Canal, said goodbye to the Vietnamese places on the corner, drove across the country. with my car full of boxes and my published manuscript folded in the passenger seat, not for any practical reason, but because I had carried it there without thinking, the way you carry things that matter. My mother cried when I called her from the road. Not sad crying, the other kind. She said she always knew. I told her she could not possibly have always known. She said that was exactly the kind of thing she had always known. I started in Edmonton on a Tuesday in late June when the sky was still light at 10 o'clock at night, and the air smelled like something clean and open that I didn't have a word for yet. A year after I started, my paper on intraoperative decision-making in high-risk bypass was cited in the National Guidelines Update for Cardiac Surgery Protocols, not just referenced, cited specifically as evidence for a change in recommended practice. The technique I had used on a retired schoolteacher from Canada on a Friday evening in November, the one that had been called lucky, was now recommended practice for left main bypass in complex cases. I found out by email, sitting in my office in Edmonton, with a cup of coffee going cold on my desk, the same way the takeout used to go cold in Ottawa. I read it twice. Then I called my mother. She answered on the first ring and I said, "I need to tell you something." And she said, "I'm listening." And I told her. And she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "Good. Tell me everything." So I did.